This video looks at the content section of the biological approach, and we're using evolution and natural selection to explain behaviour, specifically aggression. Now, in this, we're looking at the idea of aggression being an innate tendency and an adaptive response to a certain situation. You need to be able to explain the evolutionary explanation of human aggression and understand what is meant by natural selection and sexual selection. So, evolutionary psychology agrees that genes are 50-50 from the mother and the father, and a genotype is a collection of genes or guides who we are and what we will become, such as eye colour, temperament, intelligence, etc. Now, genes have developed through a process of evolution called survival of the fittest, and evolution looks at how inherited characteristics are passed on from generation to generation through a process of reproduction. Now, genes not suited to the environment will eventually die out. Now, Charles Darwin in 1859 first outlined his theory of evolution in his book, The Origin of Species, and he attempts to explain how living creatures were created, but also how they have changed over time. Now, the key ideas behind the theory of evolution are that different species have evolved from simple life forms which lived on the Earth 3 billion years ago, and that evolution occurs through a process of natural selection. Now, natural selection is the process in which heritable traits become more or less common in an environment, and the organisms that adapt to their environment are the ones that are healthier and therefore live longer and are more likely to reproduce. So Charles Darwin suggested that adaptations are driven by procreation, so everybody has a desire and a need to pass on their genes and to survive. The process of natural selection, which is the basis of evolution, suggests that only those who are best adapted to survive will be the ones that pass on their genes, and their genes are therefore shaped by the environment. The survival of the fittest suggests that anything that helps the organism survive will be what passes on, and therefore they will be the organisms that survive in the long haul. And genetic mutation is the permanent change in the gene, so if it's positive, it gets passed on, and if it's negative, it will die away. Now, the evidence for the natural selection is that each species has adapted to the environment and therefore developed unique characteristics. If you look at the picture of the bird on the board, you can see how their beaks have changed over time in order to be able to access food sources. Those who didn't change to be able to access food sources will have died away, and it's those whose beaks did change so that they were able to access the food that have survived throughout evolution. So how does all of this link to aggression? The evolutionary approach accepts that the structure of the brain has evolved to serve as an adaptive function in the environment of evolutionary adaptation. So evolutionary psychologists try to match this adaptive behaviour, and in this case aggression, to modern day humans and to argue that behaviour is genetically determined through brain structure and chemistry. So aggressive behaviour has evolved to serve adaptive problems of social living, which means that we have to be aggressive in order to be able to survive. So examples of this would be how being aggressive will allow us to gain territory and resources. So an aggressive child may be able to bully someone else in order to be able to gain money or toys. Or also for us to be able to defend against attacks. So aggression is necessary in order for us to prevent a loss of resources or status, necessary in order to get reproductive fitness. Inflicting cost on same-sex rivals, so aggression between same-sex members in order to be able to have a competition of resources and mates. So for example, an example of this would be men fighting over women. Also negotiating status and power hierarchies, so aggression is used to gain prestige and dominance among same-sex members. So for example, in a gang, you always need to be aggressive to prove yourself, which will therefore aid the sexual selection with opposite members of the sex. So for example, women always seem to be attracted to dominant and powerful men, and the argument is that to become dominant and powerful men, they've had to be aggressive. Deterring rivals from future aggression, so aggression may be used to maintain dominance or create a fear in other people. So for example, making threatening gestures, reinforcing aggressive reputation to maintain an aggressive appearance. Or deterring mates from infidelity, so being aggressive towards opposite members of the sex in order to make sure that they are faithful to you, which therefore allows you to get a desired long-term mate, which ensures paternity. So there are lots of modern day explanations of this linking to jealousy as a form of aggression. So jealousy is an emotional response to anticipated loss of affection or status, And this often leads to, or the fear of infidelity, which is the idea of being unfaithful. Now, that can be sexual infidelity, where someone is involved in other sexual behaviour, or emotional infidelity, so a fear that somebody will form an affection with another person. So men and women express jealousy in very different ways. So men need to compete with other men in order to be able to access the choosy females, or the best females as they see them. And the lower status men are more at risk of this, so they're willing to take greater risks or become more aggressive, and face maybe face-to-face contact or violent aggression in order to be able to ensure that they get the best mates that they can, and therefore they're not at risk of genetic extinction, which means that they're not going to be able to pass on their genes by having children. If the female is unfaithful, then a man faces paternity uncertainty, so they're not sure necessarily if the child that the female is carrying is theirs or someone else's. And as Darwin expresses, our main desire in life is to be able to procreate and to be able to pass on our genes. Now, if the man isn't sure that the child's theirs or not, then that obviously leaves them in a position of uncertainty. So in order to be able to avoid this, the man becomes aggressive. So because the man can't risk wasting their time and their investment on a child that isn't their own, they may show more jealous, aggressive behaviour towards either male competitors, so a man that they're intimidated by and they think is maybe after their mate, or potentially toward the female mates themselves if they suspect them of infidelity, particularly if that female is young or reproductively valuable to them, then they may become quite possessive and aggressive towards that female. Now, females are obviously always able to guarantee that that offspring or that child is theirs, so therefore they compete with other females in order to be able to get the best quality of man that is available to them. So if the male is unfaithful to the female, then that female risks losing the time that they've invested in that partner, the resources, the protection, the commitment to the children. So therefore, a female's natural response to this is to be aggressive to ensure that that doesn't happen. So women take fewer risks with violence, and therefore they use more indirect forms of aggression, such as verbal aggression. Now, evidence for the idea of men being aggressive is that cross-culturally, human violent aggression and homicide is far more common in males against other males, and is often committed by poor unmarried men than richer married ones, because it's the poor unmarried men that are at a higher risk of not being able to procreate, and therefore they use aggression to compensate for this. Within females, it's been found by Butt and Dedden that females use more verbal aggression in order to be able to maintain their status, but also reduce the attractiveness or the status of women that they feel threatened by. Now, often they'll do this by highlighting the promiscuity of another female, or putting them down, saying that they're not particularly attractive, in an attempt to try and make them look less viable to their partner. Butt and Shackleton are good support for this from 1997. Now, they gathered evidence to see what men do in response to feeling threatened in a relationship, to see if that there is any evidence for natural selection. They found that men tended to give in to women by giving her everything that she wanted in order to be able to keep her as his partner, but therefore be more threatening to other males around them who they find as threatening to them. Now, both of these two actions would aid a man's survival of the male genes and enhance their chances of procreating and having children. Butt and Shackleton also looked at women and found that it is helpful to a woman to maintain a relationship in order for them to be able to reproduce their genes. So the women therefore uses a tactic of threatening to leave the man, using verbal threats towards other women, such as "he's taken," because it's different for women, as they know that the baby they're carrying is theirs, whereas a man needs to ensure that the offspring is theirs. Dobash and Dobash found when studying violence against women that it often came from partner jealousy, and the sexual jealousy was found to lead to aggression. The study gives evidence to the theory of natural selection and linking aggression as a trait that has helped us in order to be able to survive our genes. Another argument for aggression as a requirement for survival of the fittest is this idea of competition over limited resources. So aggression may be needed to fight over limited resources such as food or shelter, and it's those who defended the food and the shelter that are more likely to survive and therefore be able to reproduce. So it's this aggressive behaviour that would be inherited and therefore would survive. Now, Lorenz in 1966 wrote about this aggression being an evolved trait, particularly in males who were fighting over limited resources. Everybody wants to be seen as stronger in order to be able to survive, and it is the humans that are aggressive that are often seen as stronger in social situations and therefore more likely to survive. The higher you are seen as in the group, the less likely you are to be attacked by somebody else because you're seen as stronger. Now, when evaluating this response, you've got to consider its scientific methodology that is used into looking into the theory. So Darwin is accepted as scientific, and he took careful observation and observed viable behaviour which could be confirmed by others. The scientific credibility of the theory of evolution is widely accepted and is seen as a very important theory. The theory can be used to explain aggressive behaviour in humans, and it has a wide body of research to support it. Another aspect of support suggested that there is maybe an alternative explanation to the evolutionary theory, such as difference in benefits of what constitutes as infidelity. So, for example, if men do not perceive emotional infidelity as fidelity, then they may not be particularly jealous in response to a partner's emotional infidelity. So, for example, this is suggesting that men may not see emotional infidelity as classing as cheating, and therefore they may not be as bothered if a woman has another male friend. Aggression can be seen as counterproductive in evolutionary terms. So, for example, consider somebody who is particularly aggressive as a human. They may actually be the ones that are putting themselves at the most risk or attracting the most aggression from other people. So, for example, somebody who wants to have a reputation as being a fighter or being particularly strong is more likely to have that challenged by somebody else and therefore be more involved in more fights and more aggressive acts, which may actually mean that they are the ones that don't survive. So that's another way of looking at this theory in terms of a criticism of it. Forced choice methodology does not allow participants to specify the level or the quantity of their agreement. So, for example, in Buss et al.'s study, although more of the men were distressed than the women by the sexual infidelity, 51% of the men were distressed by the emotional infidelity compared to a woman's 81%. So more men were distressed by emotional than sexual jealousy, which actually goes against the theory of evolution in the first place, because sexual jealousy is the one that links to procreation. The theory doesn't explain all situations, and it's always good to bring in an alternative theory as an extra critique. So Dollard's frustration aggression theory is often seen as a more acceptable explanation. Now, this suggests that aggression arises as a result of frustration from environmental influences. And if you can't produce this frustration as aggression, so for example, you're at work and you're frustrated, but it's not appropriate for you to be aggressive at work, then that aggression is displaced onto something else. So you've had a bad day, you're very, very frustrated, you can't be aggressive at work, and therefore you come home and are aggressive towards your partner. It's also worth noting that the aggressive person may have less resources, which may explain why aggression can occur towards a stranger. Some critics have criticised the evolutionary response as a justification of violence towards women, and we have to be really careful of that as an application. We don't want to be seen as saying that because it's biological, it's okay for a man to be aggressive towards a woman or for a man to be aggressive towards another man. And think of these, though. Think ethically, studying the aggression and how the findings are used in the research itself, such as issues of confidentiality, informed consent. It can also be seen as quite a reductionist approach because it focuses specifically on aggression in terms of evolution and the brain, and apart from Dollard's frustration aggressive theory, it ignores other environmental factors. Think the argument of nature-nurture as well, so this is obviously very much on the nature side of the argument, ignoring any sort of environmental influences on aggression.